Hello, I'm Freddie, and today you're listening to the Young Progressives podcast, which now I'm officially launching. So, me and maybe some other people are going to be making videos on the channel. I'm going to also launch it on iTunes, and we're going to make podcasts. We're going to make podcasts about world politics, about British politics, and about American politics, and about everything that kind of goes on. And we're gonna always show a left stance, and we're gonna show why we believe that the Democratic Socialist ideology is the best one, and we're going to promote it. We're going to talk about how neoliberalism and capitalism and things like Brexit, far-right populism will really do terrible things and are bad for all of us, just sometimes for the rich people, sometimes for no one, but then never will be good for us, and we will like to explain that. And today, my first official video under the new name, I've already done the People's Vote video, is Norwegian Democratic Socialism compared to American and British neoliberalism. And I wanted to start off today talking about this because I think the political ideology I associate the most with, not perfectly with, but the most with, is the Democratic Socialism ideology. And I greatly oppose neoliberalism or Thatcherism or free market capitalism, however you want to say it. So we're going to talk about that today, and I want to show why I believe in democratic socialism. And a good way to show that is show a democratic socialist country and show how it works. So there were three main reasons I really wanted to do. First of all, I wanted to show that democratic socialism can work, because lots of people say, no, it can't work, democratic socialism will never work. Well, this is a great example of how it does work and works far better than almost every country all around the world. In every free market capitalist country, it works better than. For the many. Not for billionaires, but for most people. So, the second reason I wanted to talk about this is because I wanted to demonstrate why I'm a democratic socialist. And why I support it, because these stats show the great things that democratic socialism creates and the positive results of it, the many positive results of it. So that was the second reason. And the final reason is that there is a rhetoric which is constantly pushed around, and it's false in many ways, by the right-wing media. And first of all, it calls Jeremy Corbyn, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Bernie Sanders socialists. They're not socialists, they're democratic socialists. Very different things, not similar at all. It's like saying neoliberalism and being a liberal are similar, completely different things. Second of all, that just ties. That's a false rhetoric, and they say that these crazy socialist schemes, by socialists I mean democratic socialist schemes, will result in economic decline, recession, mass poverty, famine, and a huge depreciation in social standards. For example, like life expectancy, or like homicide rates, or education, stuff like that. They say poverty rates will really really depreciate, and that's untrue. And they talk about how scary and terrible socialism is and it never work. But this is debunking the rhetoric pushed by the right wing media. I'd like to also note, no script for this. I've got my facts, stats, but apart from that, there's no scripts at all. But what I also wanted to say, for some of you that didn't completely know, I'm going to give the definitions of neoliberalism. And neoliberalism, or free market capitalism, or Thatcherism, is the political system that people in Britain and America mostly live under. And that is what exists in America. Many other, America, Britain, almost every country in the European Union, and basically everywhere else in the world. It's a very, very common political and economic system. So, first we're going to talk about the definition of neoliberalism. Neoliberalism is a term for different social and economic ideas. Neoliberalism is characterized by free market trade, deregulation of financial markets, individualism, and a shift away from state welfare provision. So that is the definition for neoliberalism, which I oppose. I believe it causes inequality, it causes many people to get very rich, and other people to suffer. I think it promotes people, the government, and the society not looking after each other. And if you look at everywhere in history, it causes people to die, it causes wages to go down, and it just kind of incites this mindset which says, all we want to do is make a profit as a society. We don't want to look after our citizens, we just want to make a profit. I don't think that's ever going to be a good thing. And we're going to do another video about talking properly about neoliberalism, free market capitalism, and how it doesn't work. Not just like stats showing that it doesn't work, but why it truly doesn't work. So that's the first one. So democratic socialism. Democratic socialists believe that both the economy and society should be run democratically to meet public needs, not to make profit for a few. To achieve a more just society, many structures of government and economy, like which has happened in Norway, must be radically transformed through greater economic and social democracy so that ordinary people can participate in the many decisions that affect our lives. That is a definition from the Democratic Socialists of America. That is a definition I adopt and I associate my ideology with the most. So there we are. I think everything's been explained, and we're going to go on to comparing stats. So let's have a look at what has a better GDP per capita. So GDP per capita is how much the average citizen in a country earns. Another false rhetoric or narrative pushed forward by the right-wing press is that socialist countries always spend too much money, they go into debt, they go into economic recession, they have a low GDP, and citizens earn hardly anything and they become very poor. These facts completely juxtapose that argument and completely debunk and show why it's wrong. So let's have a look. Let's start with the UK and US, which are free market capitalist countries. So the UK's GDP per capita, so average person in the UK earns $39,720.44 US dollars per year. So that's the average wage, basically $40,000 US dollars a year. Let's go on. The US GDP per capita, the average person in the US earns $59,533.66 US dollars a year. So again, that's about $60,000 US dollars, and the source comes from World Bank, which is an incredibly reliable source. It's almost impossible to ever find something from World Bank which is wrong. So let's go to the Norway GDP per capita, and that is $75,504.57 US dollars. That's basically $75,000 US dollars per year the average person earns in Norway. So that means the average person in Norway earns far more than in the UK and the US. So if you live in a democratic socialist country, you're going to earn more than if you live in a free market capitalist country, because often their economies make more. Because of various reasons. Again, we're not going to explain today, we can do another video on that. But it just highlights how people earn more in democratic socialist countries. Now we're going to talk about a nice stat, just from you can't compare. I've not got ones about Britain and UK's. It's very hard to research, but I found it in a fact about Nordic Socialism, which is democratic socialism. 70% of Norwegian workers are protected heavily by union contracts, and that's another positive thing which comes out of a democratic socialist society which looks after its workers, unlike a capitalist society which subjects their workers to terrible conditions to make a profit. 70% of Norwegian workers are protected heavily by union contracts. That means that the majority of Norwegian workers are protected very heavily by unions, which will make sure they keep their job, which they get paid fairly, they aren't subjected to terrible conditions. And I think the state will make laws about that anyway, so basically every worker there has very, very good conditions, has a good livelihood, will be guaranteed a job, gets maternity leave, etc., gets sick pay, etc., etc. In the UK, and I'm not sure about the US, but I expect because the US is probably more of a free market economy, it has more financial deregulation than in Britain, so it's even worse. Britain has something called 0-hour contracts, and it has a lot less secure work. And 0-hour contracts mean that it's like how Victorian workers worked in the Dickensian times. It would be you get called up, you go to work, you get paid per hour, You don't get hours. You don't know if you're going to work tomorrow. You don't know if you're going to work then. You get no notice about when you're going to work. You don't get maternity leave. You don't get sick pay. And you often can get subjected to terrible conditions, and you can get paid under the minimum wage. And that exists in Britain because of less restrictions towards companies. This doesn't happen in Norway. So another positive of democratic socialism is if you live in a democratic socialist country, you are going to be protected very heavily as a worker, unlike in a capitalist country. So that's a nice one. Sorry, the battery cut out, but we're going to now go on to Norway's gross debt to GDP ratio. The gross debt to GDP ratio is the ratio of debt to a country's economic output, which is a GDP. Definition for the GDP on Wiki is a monetary measure of the market value of all the final goods and services produced in a specific time period, often annually. So that's how much Norway's market is worth over a year, this economic output. And the gross debt to GDP ratio is the ratio of debt to the country's economic output. And the debt of Norway over a year is probably worth, normally, it was in 2019, 36.66% of its GDP. And I really like statistics. That's a very low amount of debt compared to a GDP. And I like this statistic because the narrative pushed forward by right-wing news is often that debt created in the country by socialist schemes will often be off the charts. Like, if Bernie Sanders says, we're going to do Medicare for all, which of course is a democratic socialist scheme or project or an idea, a progressive idea, they'd be like, oh my god, that's going to push us so far into debt, and it's going to make a ridiculous amount of debt compared to our free market capitalist system, which won't create as much debt. Well, that is wrong, and this fact shows it. Last year, Norway had a gross debt to GDP ratio of 36.6%. In 2017, the UK had a gross debt to GDP ratio of 87.4%, and in 2017, the USA had a gross debt to GDP ratio of 105.4%, which means that the UK, a free market capitalist country, creates a lot over, almost 10% over, more than 10% over, double of Norway's debt. And the US creates, compared to its economic value, almost 3 times as much debt as Norway, and they're free market capitalist countries. So that debunks the statement that socialism, or democratic or Nordic socialism, creates debt. Well, it doesn't create as much debt. It's free market capitalists who are saying that. So that debunks that argument. Democratic socialism or socialism does not result in as much debt as capitalism, like everyone else says. Now, we're going to look at happiness. I don't even know why people say it, but people often say that a Nordic socialist system makes everyone miserable because they're subjected to terrible conditions. They don't have happy lives in socialist countries. And that is also wrong. And the stats about Norway show this. So, every year since 2012, something called the World Happiness Report has been conducted. And it covers every country in the world. And we look at how the UK and US, free market capitalist countries, fare with Norway and happiness. So, the UK is the 15th happiest country on Earth, according to the World Happiness Report. The USA is the 19th happiest country on Earth, according to the World Happiness Report. But Norway, which is routinely ranked in the top 5 happiest countries on Earth, came fourth in 2019 on the World Happiness Report. So, Norway, last year, was the 4th, well, this year actually, was the 4th happiest country. And it has been crowned the happiest country in the world. So, if you want to be happier, if you want to live in a happier country, which is society makes people happier, because of many reasons, go to a democratic socialist country, because the World Happiness Report says that people are happy there. Now, we're going to look at life expectancy. So, a good measure to see how a country treats its citizens and how good its healthcare is, how healthy its citizens are, how well educated they are, how wealthy they are. Because if you're very poor, you often won't live for as long. So the better a country treats its citizens, the higher is the life expectancy. And again, Norway has the highest life expectancy out of the 3. let me find it. The UK has a life expectancy of 80.96 years. The USA has a life expectancy of 78.69 years. And according to the World Bank, the life expectancy of Norway is 82.51 years. So again, if you want to live longer, and if you want to have better healthcare, and if you want to live a wealthier life and want to be treated better for the whole of your life, move to a democratic socialist country or vote for democratic socialism, because you're going to live longer and you're going to get better healthcare. And now we've gone on to the subject of healthcare, we can look at a few more healthcare stats to consolidate the fact that the healthcare system in Norway or a democratic socialist country is far better than in a free market capitalist country. Because first of all, they invest more in their healthcare. Second of all, they don't subsidise their healthcare. And third of all, they never ever will completely privatise their healthcare like that happened in the USA. So, every year I think this was in 2018, every year there's an annual prosperity index. According to that, the US, the world's richest country, had the 27th best healthcare system, which shows free market capitalism often results in not very good healthcare compared to how the USA, the richest country in the world, should have the best healthcare, but it doesn't have the 27th best, which shows free market capitalism disregards healthcare and instead regards profits as more important. The UK, which does have the NHS, which I think is a brilliant system, and I'm very proud of the NHS as being in Britain, but it's been ravaged by Tory free market capitalism, neoliberalism, which has brought cuts and privatisation and subsidies to private companies into the NHS, which has meant it declined. Its care and efficiency has declined greatly. Finally, Norway has the 7th best healthcare system according to the annual prosperity index. So Norway, a country which is a democratic socialist country which properly invests in its healthcare systems, has the 7th best in the world, compared to the UK, which has the 19th best, and the US, which has the 27th best. So if you want to get better healthcare, vote for democratic socialism, because it will actually invest in your hospitals, in your doctors, in new technology, which will make your healthcare and probably your life a lot better. Especially if you're prone to illness, or your family's prone to illness. If you get cancer, you'll be more likely to probably survive if you're in Norway. If you have a stroke, you'll be more likely to get faster, more efficient care. And if you're in Norway, and even if it's not as serious, so say if you break your leg, it's going to be more efficient and better if you're living in a democratic socialist country. Now again, I think we got one more about healthcare. And this came from the CIA World Fact Book, and this is a sad thing to talk about, but it's infant mortality rate. And it's very important that a society limits the infant mortality rate in a country as much as possible, because infant mortality, babies dying at a young age, is an absolutely horrible thing. I think several things tie into this. Poverty can. I think how good the healthcare system is, and how well educated citizens are, because sometimes people aren't probably taught how to look after a baby to no fault of their own, but societies let them down, and maybe it can lead to conditions getting worse. So let's look at what country out of the three, spoiler alert, as Norway, has the lowest infant mortality rates, which means the least infants die. In the UK, the infant mortality rate is 3.8 deaths per 1,000 births. The US has an infant mortality rate of 5.8 deaths per 1,000 births. And Norway has an infant mortality rate of 2.2 deaths per 1,000 births. So, because of multiple things in society, which just came as a result of democratic socialism, your baby is most likely to survive if you live in a democratic socialist country. So, another reason to vote for democratic socialism, because of the healthcare system. Now we have a look at poverty. Because the rhetoric, the narrative, which is constantly thrown at us by Fox News, by even quite moderate news sources, like CNN, like The Times, like The Telegraph, which is right-wing, like The Sun, say that if you vote for democratic socialism or Corbyn or Bernie Sanders, and it will take us back to the dark ages, everyone will be poor, it'll be like in Venezuela. Well, again, that's wrong. I've got stats from the Borgen Project, from Wiki, that show that this is completely wrong. The US has a poverty rate of 12.3%, not good for the richest country in the world. The UK has a poverty rate of 20%, which is atrocious. And Norway has a poverty rate, which I was surprised by, of 7.5%. So, the country of the lowest poverty rate, which completely opposes the facts thrown us by Fox News and The Sun, is Norway, Democratic Socialist country. And what I'd like to note about this is why I was surprised is I think poverty in a country like Norway is almost close to zero. But I think the reason why it's higher is that because it's such an ethical and egalitarian society, and that Norway strives to restrict poverty as much, they have higher standards for what poverty is. So what would count as being under the poverty line in Norway would be in the UK totally fine, and you wouldn't be poor under the criteria launched by the government investigation. So I believe that in Norway it is lower than that because they have higher standards for poverty, which is a good thing. Because I think poverty should be regarded as higher than what it is, because it's hard. I don't know if I'm making sense here, but in the UK, poverty constitutes as if you can't afford to pay for shelter, well, not shelter, that's a bad way of saying it, for housing, for heating, for water, for food, for your kids, or for you. And that's what poverty constitutes as in America and the US, I expect. But in Norway, I imagine that the criteria that the government give for poverty is more like, can they afford to get their kids really nice birthday and Christmas presents? Are they able to take their kids on really nice day out, or can they, I don't know, go on holidays once a year? Maybe it's a higher criteria because they care more over there. And I think poverty should be like that. I think that we should see poverty as being, they can't go on a holiday, they can't take their kids on nice trips, because that's really important. Poverty shouldn't be they have to miss meals. It should be they can't afford to take their kids on holiday, or get them presents for Christmas. I think everyone should be able to do that. So we've gone from poverty. Now we're going to look at crime, and it will show how democratic socialist countries, with ethics in mind and their very liberal mindset, helps restrict crime. And we'll look at this by incarceration stats and reoffending, or recidivism, I don't know how to say it, stats in America, the UK, and Norway. First of all, I'm going to look at the UK. The UK has an incarceration rate of 145 per 100,000 people, which means if you come across 100,000 people in the UK, 145 of them will be in prison. Like, if you just took them out of the UK, put them in the field, 145 people would normally be in prison. The US has an incarceration rate, which means of 648 per 100,000 people, which is absolutely massive. That's a huge incarceration rate. This is according to BBC and Security Degree Hub. Now, in Norway, there's an incarceration rate of 75 people per 100,000. Which means that there's the least amount of criminals and the least amount of people in prison in Norway, in a democratic socialist country, compared to free market capitalist countries. And it's not that much worse in the UK. It's almost double the amount, but there is more crime. And that's to do, I would say, with how poverty isn't restricted in the UK. That the government don't make enough schemes to try and restrict poverty. There's not investment in stuff like Sure Start centres, which make sure kids in poor areas don't grow up and out of desperation get into crime. Education's better, which teaches people not to become criminals and how to not resort to crime. And mental health spending is better in Norway, which stops people from doing atrocities, which happens a lot in America and sometimes in the UK. And that, I believe, that is why there are far less criminals in Norway. And the final one was according to the HuffPost. Finally, I'm going to look at I've got two more with crime, and then we'll go on to at the end. I don't know if we've got anything left, actually. Maybe that's the last of it. When we do literacy rate at the end. We're going to go into the reoffending rate. And it's really important that society make sure when someone goes to prison, they don't just punish them, they don't throw away the key, they don't make their life terrible, but they rehabilitate them. They make sure when they go out of prison, they're not going to reoffend. and they're going to be able to integrate into society and fulfill a good role and a positive role for the rest of their lives. And of course, the Democratic Socialist country of their ethics, because they care about people, do this the best. The reoffending rate in the UK is 46%. So that means 46% of people who are released out of prison will go back again in their lives. The US has a terrible reoffending rate of 76.6%. So that means almost 80% of people who go to prison, when they're let out, will come back. And that's a failure of the criminal justice system. You should make sure, for the sake of just normal people in society, that when people get let out of prison, they don't offend again. And that's according to full fact in the USSC. Now, Norway has the world's lowest reoffending rate of 20%, which means that only 20% of people let out of prison will come to reoffend, and that is because they properly rehabilitate people in prison. And instead of the right wingers saying you're going too easy on them, or you're going too easy on them, they actually they re-educate them. They give them a decent life in prison, so their mental health doesn't deteriorate. They learn how to resort not to cry, to live, and they come back and sometimes lead quite a happy life, which is a brilliant thing. And they don't harm people when they get back out of prison like they do all the time in the US and sometimes in the UK. So that's a very important thing. Finally, on the little crime subsection, we've got homicide rate. And the homicide rate is the amount of murders per 100,000 people, and this is all according to the UNODC global study. Probably the most reliable source ever, the UN. So the homicide rate, we talk about the free market capitalist countries first. The homicide rate in the UK is 1.2 deaths per 100,000. So out of every 100,000 people, 1.2 people will be murdered in the UK. The US has an absolutely atrocious homicide rate, and that's because of people subjected to poverty, because of the terrible criminal justice system, and because of the amount of guns there. Out of 100,000 people, 5.3 people are murdered in the US. Of course, in Norway, this is a lot lower because of multiple reasons, like I suggested before, which all root from democratic socialism ideology. And in Norway, there's a homicide rate of 0.5 murders per 100,000 people, which is, of course, half as low, less than half of what it is in the UK, and less than a tenth of what it is in the USA. So, if you want to have a safer, more secure society, vote for democratic socialism. Now, I think we've done every single stat, actually, apart from the literacy rate. And I think because the US is so big, it was hard to conduct a literacy rate investigation there. There's not really reliable sources, and a lot of the facts differ from each other. So I didn't include the US on this one, but we had the UK. And we looked at the literacy rates, which often show how good an education system is somewhere. And of course, in a democratic socialist country like Norway, they invest in education more. The UK has a literacy rate of 99%, which means that 1% of its citizens can't read or write. That's not terrible, and this is according to the World Population Review. That's not terrible, but it could be better if they invested more in education. Guess who does? Norway, because it's a democratic socialist country. And Norway has a literacy rate of 99.9%, and I did make sure it's 99.0% in the UK. So, 10 times as many people in Britain can't read or write, which shows that Norway has a better education system. So, all the facts now, and I'm going to just summarise by saying, this video shows that if you want to earn more, if you want to be more heavily protected if you're a worker, if you want less debt in your country, if you want to be happier, if you want to live for longer, if you want to have a safer, if you want your kids to have a safer birth, if you want to have a healthier upbringing, vote for democratic socialism. If you want to have a safer, secure country where you're less likely to be murdered, vote for democratic socialism. If you want there to be less criminals in your society, vote for democratic socialism. If you want there to be a lower poverty rate, vote for democratic socialism. If you want less people coming out of prison and reoffending, vote for democratic socialism. If you want your kids to have a better chance at learning to read or write, or learn to read or write better, vote vote for democratic socialism. And if you want a better healthcare system, then again, vote for democratic socialism over capitalism, neoliberalism, which I showed aren't as good in all of those areas. So, thank you very much. That's me, over and out.